This car was a classic European racer before being reborn as a touring car. What caused its transformation from beast to beauty? Find out right here on One of a Kind. In automotive history, the 1930s were the Wild West. Everyone from engineers to enthusiasts thought they had a great idea for a car. Hundreds of companies created limited edition cars for everything from the racetrack to the social circuit. Companies like Sunbeam, Talbot, and Duroc created some of the most unique, classic, and never-to-be-repeated cars in history. These three legends ultimately combined to become one of France's most prestigious and successful companies, Talbot-Lago. This Talbot-Lago 150C SS Figoni and Falaschi competition sports roadster is unique even by those high standards. This car had a long racing history before it started a second life with a brand new body from Figoni and Falaschi. The famed racer Tony Lago, fierce rival to racing legend Ettore Bugatti, had dreams of a state-of-the-art racing program at his company, Talbot-Lago.
The car company was bred for racing. In the very beginning, he decided to make race cars, and race cars were part of his whole lifestyle. And his idea was to promote the car solely through racing and racing successes. He hired René Dreyfus, who was France's premier driver, to manage his team in 1936 and work out the bugs of his car.
In order to start a top-flight racing program, you need money, lots of money. And in the 1930s, that was hard to come by.
What I've read is Tony Lago, who built a lot of racing cars, like so many of the automobile companies in the 30s, just did not prosper. So he merged his company with Talbot, which became the Talbot-Lago that we refer to today. And that's basically what happened to the French car industry during the 30s. They just simply didn't prosper.
Short on funds, Lago contacted Pierre-Louis Dreyfus, one of the few men who could afford such an expensive hobby. Lago encouraged Louis Dreyfus to race one of his own cars. But in the 1930s, racing was a rough and tumble sport, and not for well-bred gentlemen.
In those days, the young men from the wealthy families were really not allowed to drive and race, but they developed pseudonyms and raced that way.
Racing under the pseudonym of Heldy, Louis Dreyfus financed Lago's racing team. And once this Talbot-Lago hit the racing circuit, it couldn't be stopped. Heldy pushed his racer to respectable finishes at hotly contested Grand Prix all over Europe. This Talbot-Lago 150 CSS was capable of speeds of over 120 miles per hour. The C stood for two-seater, competition model, while the SS designated it as a touring model as well.
It was basically a straight six-cylinder engine, 4 liters, 4.5 liters, depending on which model, and it had a dual overhead cam. The transmission was one that he developed himself, and the engine was nearly bulletproof.
It contained features such as a large capacity oil pan, punched handbrake lever, a dual braking system, and a higher compression ratio, normally found only on competition versions.
You may notice that there are copper backing plates on the brakes. Many of the French cars that raced did have copper backing plates, and it was to conduct the heat away from the braking system.
These cars were well over 100-mile-an-hour cars. They were reliable, they were fast, and every wealthy sportsman had to have one.
When you drive this car, it really does give you an exhilaration because it's loud and very fast. It's thrilling. It's a thrilling drive.
But in the middle of this successful racing run, Heldy suddenly decided to stop. In 1937, he took a break from racing, selling his beloved Talbot-Lago. Knowing he could make more money if he sold the chassis and body separately, Heldy sold the chassis to Alson Finlay of Paris and the body to a fellow racer. This sudden decision ended the career of a race car still in its relative prime, and although the race car would survive, its racing career was over.
Lots of deaths occurred in the 30s with these cars, both from drivers and spectators. So that's one of the discouragements, I think, from Hildy to stop racing the car. That's when it was separated and sold as a chassis to one person and the racing body to someone else.
After a deadly accident at one of the tracks, Hildy decided to take a break from racing, sell his beloved Talbot-Lago, and return to the quieter but safer life of Louis Dreyfus. But this car's second act was just beginning. How did this Talbot-Lago become even more famous after its disassembly? Find out right after this. After its racing career, the chassis of this Talbot-Lago 150 CSS was reborn with a brand new Figoni and Falaschi body.
That company formed in 1915, building small coaches for small brands, developed into a large workshop, or larger workshop, that made some of the most fantastic aerodynamic cars on the planet.
The new owner, Alson Finley, wrote a letter to the bodymakers upon delivery of his new car. "I find the body that you put on my Talbot is a real work of art," he wrote. "I hope that this style of body will bring you real success in the future."
It's an open car. It has cut-down doors, swoopy fenders. Figoni was taking his influences off airplanes and the pontoon shapes of an airplane, and Joseph Figoni confides that it was also the shape of a woman, very influenced by the human shape. And he thought that this car would really make some statements.
But the proud new owner had precious little time to enjoy his Talbot-Lago. The outbreak of World War II sent this car into exile.
It's interesting to note that this car disappeared during the war. Alson Finley lost control when the Germans occupied France in 1939. The car mysteriously disappeared. Several of these cars disappeared, and they were taken basically by the German army, and this one ended up in Czechoslovakia. No one knows who owned it. Nobody will admit who took it. Everyone was very quiet about it, but the car reappeared in the 1960s, and from then on, the ownership was very well known.
The car then knocked around Europe for a while, and it was discovered, at least as far as we know, in the Museum of Modern Art in the Museum of Sweden. It was in this museum for quite a while, then bought out of the museum and knocked around, and I discovered it in an auction, an R&M auction, and it was in terrible condition.
A dedicated team restored its fold-down windscreen, cut-down doors, leather hood strap, and competition lights, integrated into its sporty front end.
What is remarkable about this car is it has its original body. A lot of these cars lost their bodies, they had to have them remade, or they were highly modified, but this car actually had its own sheet metal. And it's a very special thing that the car was complete and not, destroyed by somebody or hit by a truck or made into scrap metal during a war metal drive.
It's a very unique car, still has its racing characteristics.
The car was just gorgeous. It was perfectly balanced. It was on a Serbase-low chassis. It had a powerful engine, a simple transmission, and the brakes worked well. This car was a dream, and you could drive your car and you could also take it to the racetrack and be very competitive.
The restoration was aided by detailed photographs that survived the war.
This restoration, we were blessed by pictures of the car as delivered, so we knew exactly what it looked like. And we had a picture of the interior and the side of the car, so we knew what was correct and not correct.
Once it entered award shows, it picked up right where it left off in 1937.
We went through an extensive restoration, and the car turned out beautifully, as you can see. It won its class at Pebble Beach. Later, it won Best of Show at Cranbrook in Detroit.
This Talbot-Lago was separated from its original body over 70 years ago. What does that do to its place in history? We'll find out right after this. This Talbot-Lago 150 CSS ended its racing career on a high note before being separated for sale into chassis and body. But since its original body was replaced, the car has become even more special.
In a Talbot-Lago like this, it's an open sports car. You have to look at the styling and the design. Is the car in balance? Does it have the French styling cues that really make it a great car? And it has all of them. It has these swoopy lines, it has cut down doors, it has a beautiful instrument array. Everything is authentic about this car. It didn't lose a lot in the time it spent wandering around the world.
The Talbot-Lago 150 CSS is one of the great stories of collaboration from the golden age of automakers. This fusion of artistic form and racing function is an enduring legacy of the craftsmen of the 1930s and is absolutely one of a kind.